Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Paul Golan. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. And tonight is an orientation class for our Secular Talmud Study. And I am here simply to welcome you. Thank you for being here. Thank you to many of you who are members of the Society for Humanistic Judaism and or one of our local affiliated communities. This program is a benefit to your membership. For those of you who are not yet members, we welcome you as well. In fact, we give you a special welcome. You may only be hearing about humanistic Judaism for the first time. This is not the venue where I will spend a lot of time explaining what that is, but I encourage you to read about it on our website. The standing on one foot version of it is we are a movement and a congregational denomination that has been around over 60 years for secular and humanistic Jews and friends and family members who very much resonate with Jewish identity and culture and history and peoplehood and holiday celebrations and life cycle events. But we are secular. We are not religious. And so in our movement, our affiliated communities do not offer prayer services, but we do have non-theistic liturgy. So again, I won't drill down on that, but if any of that sounds fascinating to you and you've never heard that before, please dig deeper on humanistic Judaism. You're welcome to participate in this course for a couple of classes before we then will ask you to become a member of either SHJ directly or one of our local affiliated communities. And part of the thinking of offering a secular Talmud study class is to acknowledge that humanistic Jews, as with all Jews, connect in so many different ways. And learning and history is one of the ways that secular and humanistic Jews connect with their Jewish identities. And the Talmud is an extremely important part of our history and heritage and can inform our ideas around ethics and how we relate to our fellow human beings. The nice thing, I think, speaking for myself personally about being a humanistic Jew, is it doesn't dictate to me how to live my life, but it can inform and help me decide for myself based on lots of other factors as well, including my humanistic values, on what is right and wrong. So I've enjoyed the classes I've been able to participate in, and I think you will as well. I'm going to turn it over to Max Buchdahl, who will introduce himself. He is the instructor for this course, and we're really glad and lucky to have him, but I just wanted to be here to kick things off to welcome you all to this orientation class. So thanks again for being here, and take it on, Max.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. Welcome, everyone. It's really nice to see the old and new faces. My name is Max Buchdahl. I'm the instructor for this course, and I live in Washington Heights in New York City, in Upper Manhattan, but I'm a native of Baltimore. I saw the Frederick in the chat, so go Keys. Yeah, so I live in Washington Heights. I've been learning Talmud for several years now in several different contexts in yeshiva and elsewhere. I completed a master's in Talmud and Rabbinics from the Jewish Theological Seminary here in New York this past year. And I've been teaching this class since only since the beginning of December. So I myself am a little bit of a newcomer, but the class has been going on since the summer. And I'm really excited to be able to have some new voices in the class, to be able to have the old voices in the class be informed with some fresh perspective. So you can, please go ahead and continue to put where you're coming from in the chat. I'm really excited to get things started. As Paul mentioned, tonight's class is going to be a little bit different than normal. Normally, we sort of dig straight into the text of the Talmud and try and unpack it as best we can. Tonight is going to be more of a sort of general overview of what the Talmud is, who are the rabbis of the Talmud, what's the what's the context, what's the historical background, what are the things that lead them to interpret the way that they do, and sort of how do they see themselves as part of one chain or one part of a much longer tradition. And I think generally when it comes to studying the Talmud, that's for me one of the things that's most valuable is, you know, basically at the end of the day, the rabbis are trying to figure out who they are and how they're supposed to relate to the people who came before them. And generally we're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to relate to those who came before us. We're trying to leave some sort of legacy for the people who come after us. So we're gonna dig a little bit tonight into what that means for the rabbis of the Talmud. What time period are we talking? Who are we talking about? What are some of the names that you might be familiar with who come up? And then only at the end, at the very, in our last few minutes, are we going to look a little bit at the topic, the actual topic that we are going to be covering, that we've been covering for the last several months, and we're going to continue starting next week. Just a brief sort of logistical note about tonight. I'm going to be sharing a PowerPoint in just a moment. After the class is over, in addition to sharing the recording of the frontal part of the presentation, I'll also share out the slides. So it's a lot of information. Don't feel like you need to retain everything. You can refer back to it at a later point. That's number one. And number two is questions. I'm sure because of the nature of what we're going to talk about tonight, people are going to have all sorts of questions and clarifications that are going to come up. You can go ahead and either put those into the chat or use the raise hand function. I'm not going to, usually I pretty much call on people and refer to the chat as things go. Because of the nature of tonight, I'm probably only going to pause every few minutes to take a look at the chat, to take a look at people who have their hands up and things like that. So you can either go ahead and put questions into the chat. You can write them down and raise your hand when I sort of when I pause, or whatever's easiest for you. Okay, I think that's everything for background. And now let's go in. Okay. All right. The other thing is that I can only, while I'm sharing my screen, I can only see a few faces, which is good for some of you who can make all sorts of facial expressions, and I won't be able to see them. But that's also a challenge. If you raise your hand without using the raise hand function, I may not see you at first. So make sure to use that function or to put your question in the chat. Okay. So where I want to start is the two Torahs, right? What are generally referred to as two different inheritances, two different Torahs. And it really is where I want to start at is on Mount Sinai. In the conception of history that Rabbinic Judaism has, there are two Torahs that were given simultaneously. Number one is the written Torah, right? That probably most people are familiar with. That's the 5 books of Moses, right? The written Torah, it's written down. Then, in addition, also was given to Moshe, to Moses, was the oral Torah, right? And the oral Torah is called oral because it wasn't written down, right? It was only passed down orally. And most of what we're going to see, most of what we talk about as rabbinic literature is the oral Torah, right? And it's made up of traditions of how to read and interpret the written Torah, right? And we'll probably talk as the course of the night goes on about why it was oral. Why not write down the things that are the traditions that are passed down in addition to the written Torah, right? What does it matter that I want to pass things down orally, right? How does it change the access to that information if you only have access to it if I tell you, as opposed to I can just read the words on a piece of paper, right? That's going to make a big difference in terms of how historically how these two things get interpreted, right? So generally we have the written Torah and the oral Torah, right? This also gets to the point that I brought up a few minutes ago about how the rabbis see themselves as connected to something that came before them, right? If rabbinic traditions, if the oral Torah is what makes up rabbinic Judaism, part of rabbinic Judaism, right? Then it makes sense to see yourself as sort of inherently connected to the written Torah that was given to Moses, right? If you see those two things as being given simultaneously. I think that the best sort of distillation of this we're going to see here in the Rambam, right? In Maimonides. Right, Maimonides, in addition to writing, some of you may be familiar with the Guide for the Perplexed, right? Maimonides' main philosophical work. In addition to that, he also wrote something called the Mishnah Torah, which was his law code, right? There's a lot to be said. People have a lot of different thoughts of whether the Guide to the Perplexed is sort of the core of the Rambam and his legal code is secondary to that or the opposite. I'm not totally going to get into that now, but in the Rambam's introduction to his legal code, he gives a history of rabbinic Judaism that is very, very useful. This is the very beginning of the introduction. These are the first words of the Mishnah Torah. We're only going to see, obviously, a very small piece of it, but I do encourage you later on, if you want a much fuller version of this history in the eyes of the Rambam, that his introduction to the Mishnah Torah is a really good place to start. And what the Rambam really does throughout the Mishnah Torah is distill, right? The Rambam is really a master at distilling a lot of information in as few words as possible, as succinct and as clear as possible, right? And that's why I thought it would make sense to bring the Rambam here to sort of describe what I mean by the difference between the written and the oral Torah. Okay, so this is the Rambam. The mitzvot given, the commandments given to Moses and Mount Sinai, were all given together with their explanations, as implied by Exodus. And I will give you the tablets of stone, the Torah, and the mitzvah. Right. So what the Rambam is keying in on here is that because the verse here says the Torah and the mitzvah, Torah and mitzvah must be two different things. Okay. I'll continue. The Torah refers to the written law, the mitzvah to its explanation. God commanded us to fulfill the Torah according to the instructions of the mitzvah. The mitzvah is called the oral law. Okay, so these are the two pieces that the Rambam is picking up on, right? We have the Torah, right, which in this verse we're referring to as the written Torah, and then we have the mitzvah, which is the explanations that come along with the Torah, right? And that's what the Rambam is calling the oral Torah, right? Rabbinic literature, rabbinic law. Okay, Moses, our teacher, personally transcribed the entire Torah before he died. He gave a Torah scroll to each tribe and placed another scroll in the ark as a testimonial. As Deuteronomy states, take this Torah scroll and place it beside the ark, and it will be there as a testimonial. Okay, Moses plays a large role here. Okay, this is just a continuation. The mitzvah, i.e. the explanation of the Torah, he did not transcribe, he meaning Moses. Instead, he commanded it verbally to the elders, to Joshua, and to the totality of Israel. As Deuteronomy states, be careful to observe everything that I prescribe to you. For this reason, it is called the oral law. Right, so just a continuation of establishing that there's this oral law, which was given at the same time, right? But has some different characteristics, right? Mainly that it's passed down orally. Okay. Even though the oral law was not transcribed, Moses, our teacher, taught it in its entirety in his court to the 70 elders. Eleazar, Pinchas, and Joshua received the tradition from Moses. Okay, so Moses receives both written and oral Torah from God at Mount Sinai, right? And then transcribes the written Torah onto tablets, right? And then all of the oral Torah that God taught him on Mount Sinai, he then teaches to 70 elders. And then that gets passed down and where the Rambam continues here is the chain of tradition of this oral Torah, this oral law that gets passed down. Okay, that's sort of, I think, as simply as can be stated, the sort of the rabbinic, the history according to the rabbis of how they get the traditions that they get. Right, and part of that is that, right, part of what's implied here is that much of what happens in rabbinic literature, including in the Talmud, is not actually sort of new revelation, but is instead something that was passed down, right? That we're just seeing in the words of the Talmud, right? So the rabbis often see themselves, and it's helpful sometimes to think of rabbinic law as not necessarily someone in the year 330 saying something new, but instead, sometimes someone just repeating something that is part of a much older tradition. Okay, I said a lot there. I'm going to pause for a second to see if there are any questions. You can put them in the chat or you can use the raise hand function. Okay. Why didn't Moses just write it down? It's not a dumb question at all. Okay. So I'll address Stephen's question first, and then Jennifer and David. So Stephen, I think part of why, and this gets this is sometimes said explicitly, there's a concern when it comes to the oral law that other people will use it against the rabbis, basically, right? Sometimes people think of this as a sort of an early polemic against Christianity, right? But this is the question of access that I talked about before, right? Which is to say that when it comes to the written Torah, right, part of the danger of writing something down and publishing it is that anyone can do anything with it they want, right? They can twist your words into saying things that you didn't mean to say, right? That's sort of the danger of publishing, right? And so just to sort of step into the rabbinic mind for a second, the written Torah had to be written down, right? I guess, right? But the oral Torah, the only way that we can really preserve it and make sure that that the words of the oral Torah are understood as best as possible, and that we can preserve the true meaning, is to only pass it down in very small groups of people orally, right? So I think that's, at least in the rabbinic mind, that's why the oral Torah remained oral. And I think I have this in the slide later on. The Talmud itself wasn't written down until the 8th century, right? So this oral culture lasted a really long time, and it only changed. That's not to say that no parts of the Talmud were written down before then, but as a sort of collective thing, wasn't written down until much later. And part of why, it just became a necessity at some point. The corpus was just too large to not write anything down. So eventually it just got to be too massive, and you had to write down, otherwise you were going to lose things, right? But sort of in an ideal world, according to the early rabbis and according to this version of history, in an ideal world, the oral Torah would never have been written down. Okay, so that's an important point. Thank you, Steve, for asking that question. I thought the whole Tanakh was the written law, right? So the whole Tanakh is the Nevi'im, the prophets, and Ketuvim, the writings, which is the rest of the Tanakh, is also is not part of the oral Torah, but it doesn't really have the same legal consequence as the 5 books of Moses. I'll just say it that way. So it is written law in a sort of basic sense, but in terms of legal implication, the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, sort of stand alone. Okay. Don't you think it's important to note that the Torah is mythology? Right. So thank you, David, for bringing that up. What I'll say is that what's important to me and what I think is important in understanding the Talmud is understanding where the rabbis are coming from, right? So the rabbis do not see the Torah as mythology, and it's important to note that there is a way of seeing Torah as mythology. But I think in terms of I think in order to best understand the Talmud, it's really important to understand how the rabbinic mind functions. And that's sort of, Larry, to your question as well, right? I think it's important to present this tradition as the rabbis present it. Okay. Great. What are the crowns that Rabbi Akiva interpret later on? So we'll get to that a little bit later, Liviu. Dave, yes, 8th century CE. So and then Rick, just briefly, I think the purpose of this class is to understand what the Talmud is, sort of at a basic level, and we will be dealing with Talmud from a secular perspective, but just in terms of as an introduction and understanding the Talmud as best as possible, I do think, as I said, it's important to understand the rabbinic mind, right? You don't have to take any of these things as, and anything more than an understanding of a certain version of history that I think will help you best understand the Talmud when we get to learning the Talmud. Okay. All right, I'm going to continue. So what comprises the oral Torah? Okay, there are many pieces of the oral Torah, right? We're going to be learning the Talmud, but it's important to understand the background and other pieces that make up the oral Torah, right? We're going to go through these things one by one, right? But we're going to look at Midrash Halacha. We're going to look at Mishnah, at Tosefta, the 2 Talmuds, right? Some of you may know that there are 2 Talmuds, others not, right? There are 2 Talmuds, right? We're going to be studying the Babylonian Talmud. And when most people say Talmud, they mean the Babylonian Talmud, okay? And then we're going to look at Aggadic Midrash, right? Midrash may be a concept that some of you are familiar with. Okay. All right. Great. So first, Midrash Halacha. This is something that we've been talking about a lot in class the last few weeks, and okay. So sort of gets to the piece I've been talking about in terms of the 2 Torahs, right? But one thing that the rabbis often do is derive law directly from a verse that doesn't always seem straightforward, right? So it's one thing if the Torah says do not murder, right? Maybe it's not just such a simple thing, but let's just say that that's a simple commandment, right? That might be clear enough, right? But there are a lot of times where the Torah isn't so clear, and so part of what the rabbis try to do is jump into that gap and derive more law, right? Sometimes, and this, Liviu, this gets a little bit to your question, right? Sometimes the rabbis interpret things by deriving law from what seem like very minuscule extraneous words, or sometimes, as you say, a crown on top of a letter, right? Some of you may have seen before in a Torah scroll, right, that some letters have special crowns, right? So there's a tradition about Rabbi Akiva trying to derive so much that he would even derive things from how those crowns are formatted, right? So this is just one example of how this might work, right? And Midrash Halacha there are collections of this, collections usually based around each book. So there are collections on the book of Exodus, on Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Sometimes this type of work shows up in other ways. So for instance, the way that the Rambam read that verse in Exodus earlier to distinguish between the written and the oral Torah, right? That's a version of Midrash Halacha, right? He's quoting the Talmud actually. But these things show up in a lot of different places. Okay, so this is one example of how this works. And for those of you who've been in the class recently, you know we've been dealing with this type of derivation quite a lot in the last few weeks, thinking about how to sort of make the most of each and every word in the Torah, right? At least how the rabbis do that as it relates to lost objects, right? So this is a verse in Leviticus. It's about Sukkot, right? On the first day, you shall take for yourselves the product of hadar trees, branches of palm trees, boughs of leafy trees, willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before Hashem your God 7 days. Right? One of the derivations here, and I've bolded it here to make it a little bit clearer, right? For yourselves, right? And the way that the rabbis read this is to say that, right, the verse could have just said, you shall take. Right? The verse just could have said, on the first day, you shall take the product of hadar trees, et cetera, et cetera. Right? But the way that some people read the Torah is to say that just those words for yourselves are meaningful enough that we need to derive something from it. Okay, so what do we derive? For yourselves means belonging to you and not what is borrowed or stolen, from which it was ruled, one does not fulfill their obligation on the first day of the festival with their neighbor's lulav. Right, but if the person wishes, they may give it as a gift to their neighbor and the neighbor to the neighbor, even if it's 100 people. Right, so what we do is, it says here on the first day, and it says here for yourselves, right? So what the rabbis derive from that is on the first day, your lulav needs to be your own. It can't be borrowed. It can't be stolen. Nothing like that. It needs to be your property, right? So that's just one example of how we saw this example a few weeks ago. For those of you who were in the class, it's just one example of how this works, and it's a very common way that the rabbis do law. Sometimes it will sort of work the other way. We've seen this too also in the last few weeks, right? Sometimes the rabbis will have a law and they're trying to find where in the Torah it comes from, right? So that's sort of working backwards. Sometimes it works forwards like this, starting with the verse. Okay, just gonna check the chat. Okay, the tradition that Elazar received is the oral tradition. Yes, yes, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Great. Just want to make sure there's nothing else. Great. Okay. So the Mishnah. The Mishnah is a sort of the first time that this material, which according to rabbinic history had been given down at Sinai, the Mishnah was the first time that all of those traditions were collected together, right? The time period that we talk about here with the Mishnah is, it's hard. I'll just say to begin with here, all of the dating that I give in this entire presentation, there are thousands and thousands of pages worth of ink in academic journals about these dates. That is obvious. That is not what we're getting into today. I just want to say that there are a lot of debates about where exactly some of these time periods begin and end. But just for ease, this is the Tannaitic era, right? Tana means teach or repeat in Aramaic. And the Tannaitic era lasts roughly from the beginning of the 1st century until the year 220. All of the people, this entire era we're talking about, is in the land of Israel. Okay, obviously this time period of roughly 200 years, right? One of the most important things that happens in this time period is the destruction of the temple, which happens in 70, right? And it's really only after the destruction of the temple that that this production really picks up, right? We don't really know so much about the connection between the rabbis of the Talmud who come after the destruction of the temple and the any sort of rabbinic elite that may have existed before the destruction of the temple, right? Some people say that the rabbis are just a continuation of the Pharisees, right, who were around, in the time of the temple. That may be true, but it's not so clear. We do know that there are important rabbis who lived around the time of the destruction and beforehand. Right? There was actually there's a sort of smaller time period that's before the Tannaitic era, which is called the Zugot, right? The pairs, right? The most famous of those pairs, of course, is Hillel and Shammai, who you might know. They live around the time of Jesus, right, in the 20, 30-ish time period. But this period really kicks off only after the destruction of the temple. Okay, and for that next period of that 150 years, from 70 until 220, right, there is a lot of production. The Mishnah is eventually published, and I should say, generally speaking, published orally around the year 220, right? The organization of the Mishnah is done, at least traditionally thought of to have been done by someone named Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, right, who was both a rabbi and also a political leader of the Jewish community in the land of Israel at the time. Okay, so some people say that he was he is the one who did it because he had sort of political access that other people didn't, and so he was able to sort of move things along in a way that other people weren't. Right. There are also a lot of questions about. Let me actually start with the bottom one. What Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi did is organize all of this mass corpus of rabbinic tradition into 6 different orders, right? And then within each order there are 6 tractates, right? The orders are here, you see at the bottom: seeds, festivals, women, damages, holy things, and purities. Okay, I'm going to show you a chart in a second. There are a lot of questions about what exactly the Mishnah is, right? The Mishnah sometimes seems like a law code, oftentimes seems like a law code, right? Sometimes it seems like maybe it's a curriculum for someone who's training to be a rabbi. Sometimes an anthology or a philosophical treatise, right? There are all different ways. Part of why I say that the Mishnah doesn't always seem like a law code is that the Mishnah sometimes gives multiple opinions about the way that a law should go, and then doesn't say which one we follow. Right? So it's very strange for something calling itself a law code to sometimes not actually tell you what the law is, but instead to present 2, 3, 4, 5 different opinions. Right? So even though it sometimes presents itself as a law code, doesn't always really do that. Okay. Great. How can it be published if it was not written down? So there's an article by Professor Saul Lieberman called "The Publication of the Mishnah." I guess as Barry and Catherine, you have the same question. What I mean, right? So it's sort of a question of what exactly it means that it was published. Generally speaking, what we mean by that is that it would have been taught orally to several different people, right? And they would have, as in the traditions, would have just been passed down orally, person to person to person, right? And there was and then what I mean by published, I guess, is that at a certain point, it was organized in a specific way, and that's how it was taught, right? That before the Mishnah was organized by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, all of this mass corpus, at least sort of in the traditional way of thinking about this mass corpus was just floating out there, right? There were all these different people who had all this different material. It wasn't collated. It wasn't organized in any sort of systematic way. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is the one who changed that and said, no, we're going to have systems here. Right, so here are the 6 orders, right? I mentioned these before, right? We'll look at this later on in class, but we're going to be learning Bava Metzia here, which is within the order that's called damages. Okay, but this is the Mishnah. This is how the Mishnah is set up: 6 orders at the top here, and then different tractates on different topics relating to the order within each one. Okay. So one of the things, right, there's a lot of questions people can ask about why things are ordered certain ways. Why is this topic in that order? Why is this topic first in that order? It seems like it should be another way. People have all sorts of theories. There's one theory, Rabbi Zacharias Frankel, who some of you may know is sort of he's thought of it generally as the forefather of what we know now as conservative Judaism. He was also an academic scholar as well. His theory is that as you go along from seeds to purities, you go farther and farther away from everyday life, right? That seeds, right, and this Jewish society at the time around 1st, 2nd, 3rd century CE was an agricultural society, right? And so the thing that was closest to everyday life was planting a seed, right? And then things move sort of further and further away from everyday life all the way up until the temple, right? It's one theory of how this works, but it's not totally clear why things were organized the way they were. Okay, I see Jacinda has a question here. Given that these laws were orally presented to 70 different followers, and given that some of the laws were interpreted so pedantically as to rely on crowns on characters, how is it possible there was not concern that these interpretations weren't massively changed within just a few generations? Jacinda, you've stumbled upon basically the entire life's work of the professor David Weiss Halivni. That is basically his entire career I don't want to reduce it so much, but I'll just say that there's a large strand in the world of academic Talmud study of the last century or so that is trying to say that that there are traditions that got corrupted over time, right? And part of the job of a modern academic Talmud scholar is to reconstruct what may have been an original intention that got lost because they got corrupted. I will also just say, I mentioned that the Mishnah wasn't written down at first; it was published orally, and Jacinda, it's a great question, an important concern about the corruption piece. That there are several different manuscripts of the Mishnah, right? There's not really one official Mishnah. There is the printed edition, which most people think of today as being the official Mishnah, but there are many different manuscripts that have all sorts of differences, all sorts of variations. The same goes for the Talmud itself. And it is remarkable among all of those different manuscripts how close they are, right? Because they came from different time periods and reflect possibly different traditions of how the Mishnah should go. There are certainly massive differences between some manuscripts, but it does seem that over the course of hundreds of years, up until, let's say, the 7th or 8th century CE, that for the most part, things were kept much more intact than one may expect. I'll just say it that way. Okay, but it's a great question. Okay, first you plant, then you party, then you get to women. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Susie, refer to different versions. This way Judaica cites so many different versions of the Talmud. So there are all sorts of different versions of the Talmud as it's printed today. But there was a printed edition of the Talmud in the 16th century that is basically standard across any Talmud that you'll find today. So things have pretty much been standardized, but there's online access to all sorts of different manuscripts. I'll just say maybe the easiest way to say it is that the printed edition is not necessarily the version of the Talmud that makes the most sense. It's just what the printer decided to print. And there are a lot of times that you read the printed edition and you're very confused, and then you look at a manuscript and you say, why didn't the printer just print something that was much clearer, right? But today there is sort of a standardized edition. Okay. Jennifer, there are many other ancient tribal religions who have a long oral history. Yeah, absolutely. Right. I think it always sort of amazes me how how this sort of oral tradition was preserved the way it was. and the sort of memory for oral traditions that people had in that time that just I think pretty much no one in the world has today. Is there more variety in the parchments of the Torah or ones from the Talmud? So parchments of the Torah is a little more complicated um, because it's a good question. My sense is that there aren't as many parchments. Oh, I don't. That's not. I don't know. It's a good question. I mean that the Talmud is also significantly longer than the Torah, so it's hard to make that comparison. Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. I'm not exactly. It's hard to answer. What's the difference between Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi's Mishnah and that of Maimonides' Mishnah Torah? Great, amazing question. Uh, Maimonides, when Maimonides wrote the Mishnah Torah, his goal was Mishnah Torah just means second Torah. His goal basically was to override everything that had come before him except for the Torah, right? What Maimonides' goal, his goal, I think, was to say to someone, all you need in order to live a Jewish life is the Torah and my book, the Mishnah Torah, right? You don't need to spend all this time learning the Mishnah, learning Gemara, which is really complicated. Just you have the Torah, you have what I just wrote. Everything should be simple. Go spend most of your time studying philosophy, right? That's basic. That's one way to understand Rambam's goal. So the Mishnah Torah, first of all, comes about 1,000 years after the Mishnah. And it's also organized much differently, right? The Rambam does not follow this sort of 6-order formula from Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi. He comes up with his totally own original system of or structure for Jewish law, I should say. But he is basing everything that he says off of the Mishnah and the Talmud. Yeah. Okay. Great. Let me see here. I think Great. I think this is a good place to pause for 5. So generally, the way this class works, we go until 9 p.m. Eastern time. We take a short 5-minute break right around here, the halfway point. So I think now is a good time to take this break. I have 8:16 Eastern, so we'll be back at 8:21. So everyone should get some water, use the restroom, whatever you need to do, and we'll see you in 5 minutes. Okay, let's start to come back now. Just to address two of the pieces in the chat from a moment ago. Right, Steve, I think that the telephone game is a useful framework in sort of thinking about how these things get passed down. And just your question on Pirkei Avot. So Pirkei Avot isn't so much a summary of law as much as it's about sort of ethical sayings, right? But it is good. It is helpful, I think, to think of the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, as a summary of important laws. Yeah. Why is it said that in order to learn how to respect one law, you had to know all the Talmud, since it's organized in 6 categories? So, well, it does seem that there were people who were more expert in one category, let's just say, than another. But oftentimes when you learn the Talmud, it sort of seems like, maybe this is where you've heard this said, it seems like the expectation is that you know all of the Talmud. That's sort of something that can sometimes be frustrating. Okay, great. So we're continuing here. So I want to look at this is the Tosefta, right? Which is the easiest way I think to think of it is it's the same time period as the Mishnah, but it's traditions that didn't make it into the Mishnah, right? So I mentioned a few minutes ago that when the Mishnah was being compiled, right, Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi was trying as best as possible to codify and to preserve as much as possible, but he couldn't preserve everything. And so, generally speaking, we think of the Tosefta as everything that didn't make it into the Mishnah, right? It's organized the same way with those 6 orders that I mentioned before. It's much longer than the Mishnah, or about 3 times as long. And it's sort of confusing sometimes to think about how exactly to relate to the Tosefta, whether it's a commentary on the Mishnah, meaning that it's after the Mishnah, or that it's sort of a supplement that you're supposed to look at side by side. Also, many pages worth of academic opinions on that. The material from the Tosefta is found in the Talmud, right? Sometimes it's sort of stated explicitly that this is not from the Mishnah, but generally speaking, even though a certain piece of the Tosefta didn't make it into the Mishnah, it is still, because it's from the same era as the Mishnah, the Tannaitic era, which I mentioned before, because it's from the same era, it's thought of as sort of on an equal authoritative plane. Okay, it just didn't make it into the Mishnah for whatever reason. A whole nother class on the relationship between the Mishnah and the Tosefta. That's the Tosefta. Yeah. Okay. Great. So now on to the Babylonian Talmud, right? As simple as I can say, the Babylonian Talmud, which is sometimes called the Gemara, right, are discussions based on the Mishnah, right? Basically, and I think what we do in this, what I like to do in this class, and what we've done when we've seen Mishnah so far, is sort of look at the Mishnah on its own terms, meaning look at the original layer on its own terms, and try and ask questions, raise difficulties, because oftentimes when you learn a Mishnah, there are all sorts of things that are unclear, right? And because there are things that are unclear, and also, as I said earlier, sometimes the Mishnah will present several different opinions without giving you which one we follow, which one is the law, right? The Talmud has to come along and both try and understand what the Mishnah is trying to say sometimes. It's often not so clear, even just on a basic level, what the Mishnah is trying to say. Sometimes the Gemara will try and figure out who the law is according to. Sometimes it will try and figure out a justification for the law based on a verse from the Torah, right? That's sort of the work that the Talmud does. The people who have been in this class since I started, since the summer, can tell you all sorts of things about how this how some of the examples of how this works. In terms of language, so the Mishnah was written in basically exclusively in Hebrew, rabbinic Hebrew. So very similar to biblical Hebrew, but somewhat different. The Babylonian Talmud was written in a combination of rabbinic Hebrew and also Jewish Babylonian Aramaic. Okay, so I was told once by a teacher that actually the amount of Aramaic in the Talmud is only somewhere between like 10 and 12%, which to me feels very, very low. But I think one of the reasons it feels so low is that Aramaic is much harder. There are very few native Aramaic speakers in the world today. But let's say that's that 10 to 12% Aramaic. Okay, there are several layers of generations in the time of the Talmud, right? We said the Talmud was, the Mishnah was published around the year 220. The way that it was published is that a student of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, goes by the name Rav, he was a student of Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi in the land of Israel, and he took the published Mishnah, obviously not took physically, but he knew a lot in his head, and he went to Babylonia, and he said, this is the latest authoritative Jewish law, right? That's how this all gets started. Okay, so the period, so we said the era up to 220 is called the Tanaitic era. The Tanaim are the names of the people who make up that era. The next period, starting in 220, and this is also a lot of debate, but let's just say until the year 500, this is called the Amoraic period, right? And the rabbis of this period are called the Amoraim. Okay. Great. There's also a period later on which sort of seals the Talmud. I think that's called the Sevaraic period. We're not totally going to get into that now. Great. And then some of these, I think I mentioned this earlier, right? It wasn't transferred onto the written page until the 8th century CE, and it wasn't printed. It was printed for the first time in Venice in the year 1523. That's the Babylonian Talmud, and we're going to see a version of what that printing looks like in a few slides. But that printing has basically been standardized, and it's what you'll find basically anywhere nowadays. There's also a second Talmud called the Jerusalem Talmud, or the Yerushalmi, which just means of Jerusalem. Sometimes it's called the Palestinian Talmud. Usually in academic circles, you'll see it called the Palestinian Talmud. The structure of the Jerusalem Talmud is the same as the Babylonian Talmud, right, in terms of the 6 orders, and it's also a commentary on the Mishnah. But there are several differences, right? First, obviously, it's the traditions that come from the land of Israel, whereas the Babylonian Talmud obviously are the traditions that stem from Babylonia, right? Mostly talking about modern-day Iraq, right? The Jerusalem Talmud, one of the main differences is that the entire first order, right, of seeds, which we saw, I'll go back to it for a second, right? This entire first order here, except for brachot, the first one, the one on blessings, there is no seeds in the Babylonian Talmud, right? There's no discussion of any of the Mishnah here, except for brachot in the Babylonian Talmud, whereas the Jerusalem Talmud does have an entire Talmud on seeds, right? The reason that you could say is that, right, in the land of Israel, most of seeds has to do with tithing law, which applies, generally speaking, in the land of Israel, right? And so because it was more relevant in the land of Israel, they studied that material more. They had more to say about it. Not so outside the land of Israel in Babylonia. Also, there is no Jerusalem Talmud on the final 2 orders of the Mishnah, holies and purities, right? It's a big discussion whether or not it did exist once and has been lost, or if it never existed at all, but we don't have access to it. There have been several forgeries, but at the very least, we don't have it. There's also several differences, several other differences between the Babylonian and Palestinian Talmuds. The language is much different, right? Aramaic, as it was spoken in the Galilee in the land of Israel, was much different than the way it was spoken in Babylonia. Generally speaking, the Jerusalem Talmud, right, this sort of gets to the question of when the Jerusalem Talmud was closed. The rabbinic activity in the land of Israel stops pretty suddenly at the end of the 4th century, right, somewhere around the year 380 or so. Right, a little unclear what happens exactly. Maybe there's some sort of political persecution that makes that activity stop, or there's some sort of natural disaster. But at the end of the day, things stop. Whereas in Babylonia, rabbinic activity as it relates to the Talmud continues for another, say, 200 years. So for that reason, the Jerusalem Talmud is not as well edited or compiled as the Babylonian Talmud, which makes it much more difficult to understand. Right? So the Jerusalem Talmud is this is why when most people say Talmud, they mean the Babylonian Talmud. Many people don't even know that the Jerusalem Talmud exists or anything about it. Right? The reason for that is that the Babylonian Talmud, it's much more well edited. It still is very difficult, but there's a long reading tradition, reading history of the Babylonian Talmud, whereas the Jerusalem Talmud is sort of neglected. It used to be that people thought that the Jerusalem Talmud was sort of reflected a less intellectually rigorous curriculum than in Babylonia. But actually, what some scholars have found in recent generations is that what happened, let me just get some people. What happened is that basically, if you take a section of the Babylonian Talmud and freeze it at the end of the 4th century, which is to say freeze it when the Jerusalem Talmud closed, if you line those two things up, you'll find actually very similar language, very similar structure. Right? The reason why the Babylonian Talmud seems more intellectually rigorous and is more intellectually rigorous is that there was a long period after the close of the Jerusalem Talmud of editing and clarifying and things like that. Okay, that's right. Also, I should say that the cultural backdrop in these two places are much different. Right? We're talking about Roman Palestine, right? Where Jews have been, where the temple has been destroyed, right? There's the rise of Christianity, right? As opposed to Sasanian Babylonia, where there are a lot more similarities between Rabbinic Judaism and Zoroastrianism as between Rabbinic Judaism and pagan worship, let's say. Zoroastrianism becomes the official state religion in Sasanian Babylonia. So because of some of those cultural differences, there's a lot more to say about this is a whole another arena of academic study, the sort of religious and cultural backdrop in these places. But that also leads to several significant differences between the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. Okay, I'll pause here. I saw a few things in the chat. You can also go ahead and feel free to raise your hand if you have questions. Yeah, Jude, please go right ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'm not as informed about my cultural history that you're referring to. Can you explain those cultural aspects a little bit more? I know it probably is a long discussion, but if you can boil it down, the cultural backdrop. I'm not familiar with the Sasanian Babylonian and the Zoroastrianism,
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, if you could.
Sure. I'll sure. So in Babylonia, right, let's just say the cultural the people who are it's Persian rule, right, in Babylonia. Okay. The Sasanian Empire is the empire that exists in Babylonia at the time of the Babylonian Talmud, right? And the official state religion of the Sasanian Empire is Zoroastrianism, right? This is so I see you're probably looking things up. That's great. There's a whole sort of and I guess what I mean by cultural background is that there is, I guess another important piece here is that there is probably more persecution of Jews in the land of Israel by the Roman Empire, right? The Roman Empire is the empire that destroyed the temple, right? It's the empire that conducted massacres against the Jewish people in the time of the Bar Kokhba. I'm not going to get totally into all of this, but right, that the Jews in the land of Israel really, 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 really hated the Romans a lot. There was a lot of animosity between the Roman Empire and, let's just call it, the Jewish community of the land of Israel. Things were much more relaxed comparatively in Babylonia, right? There wasn't the same sort of animosity between the Persian government and the Jewish people, right? And there was a lot more sort of religious. I mean, it's a whole question of, is Rabbinic Judaism a little bit more similar to Zoroastrianism because they were more impacted by Babylonian culture, and so they maybe adopted some sort of cultural affinities of Zoroastrianism, right? It's a long question, but I'll just say there are scholars. I'll put them in the chat here for a second. If you're interested more in this topic, you should look at the work of a scholar named Shai Secunda. Right? He's written a ton on this particular subject.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Okay, Gabby, the English translation of the Mishnah in Sefaria is I think the default one is Adin Evan Israel Steinsaltz, who sometimes is reading according to Rashi or according to others. Is there a way to distinguish Mishnah from Gemara, the Tanaim? So if you're on the main Sefaria page, if you click Mishnah, you can then see just the Mishnah, right? Whereas if you press the Gemara, you can see the Mishnah with the Gemara. Maybe in a future class, I can do like a brief Sefaria sort of scroll through and show things. That'd be helpful. Why is brachot an exception? So brachot doesn't really belong in agriculture, right? Brachot is the laws. I'll just say brachot here. Laws of blessings, right? And prayer, right? So prayer and blessings you do anywhere, right? But there are some laws as it relates to agriculture which are only applicable in the land of Israel. Right? So that's the main piece there. Okay, let's charge ahead. I'm not going to do too much here, but so there's another sort of genre of rabbinic literature called Agadic Midrash. Most people, when they say, "Oh, I know this Midrash about Abraham and the idols," this is the type of Midrash they're talking about, right? We saw earlier Halachic Midrash, which was deriving law from verses. This is telling stories based on verses, right? There's a long genre of Agadic Midrash, and you can find it in several different places. In both of the Talmuds, there are collections of Agadic Midrash. I think in this class someone brought up Midrash Rabbah, like Exodus Rabbah and things like that. That's Agadic Midrash. And Agadic Midrash even makes its way into sort of more legal works, things like the Mishnah and the Tosefta. Great. Okay. Great. That is what I wanted to say about Midrash for now. Okay, so what happens to the Talmud after the Talmud? I said earlier about the Mishnah that the Mishnah sometimes is like a code of law and sometimes not. And the same, I think, can be said of the Talmud. There are many times where it seems like the Talmud is trying to adjudicate law, right? There are many other times where the Talmud, like the Mishnah, will go through all sorts of different opinions and then not come to a conclusion, right? And so you can say, how can you call this thing a law code if I just read 5 pages of discussion about a law, but you never told me you didn't tell me what the law was, right? It's only after the close of the Talmud that the Talmud becomes the locus for all Jewish law, right? There are times in the Talmud where you'll get to an end of a sugya. Sugya is the word for a section of the Talmud. You'll get to an end of a section, and then you'll see the law is like this, right? In the Aramaic, hilchata blank, right? Those basically exclusively are post-Talmudic, right? They were sort of shoved in the what's called the Gaonic period, right? Which say roughly from 700 until 1038, right? In that period, right, the Geonim were reading the Talmud and they said, I would really like to know what the law is. I was like, thank you for telling me those 3 pages of very complex legal discussion, but at the end of the day, I need to know what to do. And it's only in that period do those insertions of the law is blank get in. There are 2 periods of rabbinic Jewish history after the Geonim, right? First is the Rishonim period. This is really the big growth of analysis of the Talmud. Some names here of people you might, so right, Rambam is a Rishon, is in the Rishon period. So is Rashi, right? This is also when Jews start to be living in more places, right? During the Gaonic period, most Jews are in Iraq and North Africa, right? After the 11th century, they start to split off to also be in, Central and Western Europe, right? That's new. Then there's the Acharonim period, roughly starts around the year 500 with the Shulchan Aruch, right? The main code of religious Jewish law today. And we're not really sure if that period is over or not. Some people say maybe the Holocaust was the end of that era, but it's hard to define an era if you're still in it. Anyway, so that's a little bit about sort of the life of the Talmud after the Talmud. I'll just say again, I know there's a lot of information. I'm going to send out the slides afterwards. You can take your time. You can send me email follow-up questions. This is just the beginning. Okay. Two main commentaries on the Talmud. We're going to look at what these look like on the page in a second. One is Rashi, right? Rashi is a running commentary, right? At the end of the day, Rashi is just there to help you understand what's happening step by step, right? Oftentimes when you read the Steinsaltz translation on Sefaria, which I'll talk about more in a little bit, Steinsaltz, who's living in the 20th century, is basically just telling you Rashi, right? He doesn't always say so, but sometimes he's just telling you Rashi. If you speak French, sometimes Rashi will translate a word into Old French, but even I think some modern French speakers can sometimes recognize what he's trying to say. Okay, then there's the school of the Tosfos, right? Started by Rashi's grandchildren, right? This is a much different style of commentary. It's not a running commentary usually. Every once in a while it will be, but usually they're going to disagree with their grandfather Rashi and suggest a different interpretation. Sometimes they're going to say, wait a second, this place in the Talmud tells us this, but there's another place that seems to contradict that. And then they're going to try and reconcile the two. Sometimes they'll report local customs in medieval Germany, let's say. Sometimes, and I was going to show an example of this. I don't know if we got to it actually last time. Sometimes the Tosfot can be thought of as a continuation of the Gemara, right? It's as if the Gemara were to continue and ask another question. This is the type of question that they might ask next. Okay. I'm going to pause here if people have questions. Tosfos is the one that complicates things. That's for sure. Yes. I know I'm throwing a lot of information out there. Any other questions at this juncture? Also, my hope is that once we're actually like inside studying the Talmud, some of these things will click and make more sense. Hopefully, for those of you who've been in the class for the last few months, there are pieces that you maybe recognize or that hopefully you can understand better. Okay. All right. So what are we learning? Right? What are we doing? We're learning the second chapter of Bava Metzia, right, which deals with lost objects. Right. So if I show these are our 6 orders. Right. I have this arrow here going to Bava Metzia. Right. So this order, the order of damages, right, is what it is. It's in large part tort law, right, rabbinic tort law. There are sometimes, and this sort of gets to the comments earlier about what is secular Talmud. I know that it's perhaps when I started, it seemed like how could the Talmud be secular given some of the the Rambam that we saw. There are pretty large sections of Bava Metzia in which that are not theistic at all, right? That don't have the sort of same theistic baggage that other parts have. And I think Bava Metzia is one of those examples. You may notice that there are these 3 tractates, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, which all start with the same word, Bava. The word Bava means gate. And these three tractates, Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, and Bava Batra, used to all be one tractate altogether that was called Tractate Nezikin, right? The tractate of damages, right? Same as the order here, right? But each of them was so massive that 2,000 years ago, we're talking, very massive. We ended up splitting all of damages into three different tractates. Bava Kama in Aramaic means the first gate. Bava Metzia means the middle gate, and Bava Batra means the last gate. Okay, so we're going to be studying Bava Metzia, which literally translates to middle gate, right? That doesn't really tell you anything what it's about, but that's what we're studying. Okay, this is what the Talmud looks like in the original, right? Since the first printing, since the 1520s, this is what it looks like. You have the text of the Mishnah and the Gemara here, right? On the inside column, you have Rashi. Wait a second. On the inside, this inside column, you have Rashi. Okay, on the outside column, you have the Tosfot. This is actually a clearer picture here. This is better. Right, so here you have the Mishnah, right, in section A. You have the Gemara in B, which is commenting on the Mishnah. Right, C here, you have on the inside, you have Rashi. And then on the outside here, Tosfot, sort of always across from Rashi. Right, on the side, you have all sorts of other, I can go into what each of the things on the side is. I'm not going to do that right now. But some of the things on the side are references to legal codes, references to other places in the Talmud where this material is quoted. So if there's something that's quoted in the Talmud and you want to know if it shows up elsewhere in the Talmud, you go right up here and you have that reference, right? It has other commentaries. It has Torah verses that are quoted on that page, all sorts of other things. I should also just say that earlier printings of the Gemara did not have all of these bells and whistles, right? It's only really in the last several decades that you get a Gemara page that is so, excuse me, so filled out in the margins, right? If you look at an old, even this is up here, I have my grandfather's Gemara that he bought in the 1950s, looks much, much different, right? That's not, he bought his Gemara in 1959, right? Not that long ago. Okay. Great. Why did you pick Bava Metzia? So it's a great question. It wasn't me, but I agree with the choice, I'll just say. It's really, right, and right, Gabby here says, right, it's even sometimes the first tractate given to kids for study. It's great introductory material. It really is. Just into sort of the mind of the rabbis and how they derive things. It has a lot of basic concepts. It's a great chapter. Okay. Where is Agadic Midrash on the page? So Agadic Midrash is sort of folded into it's just part of the Talmud, right? It's not always distinguished so clearly from other layers of the Gemara. This is part of what makes the Gemara difficult sometimes, is that the layers are not always so clear and the genres are not always so clear. There are Agadic Midrash collections, right? If you go out and buy Exodus Rabbah, right, that is a collection of only Agadic Midrash, right? But here it's all, the Talmud is a mix of all kinds of different genres, Agadic Midrash just being one of them. Okay, could I, the English version of the page of Talmud, I'll check with Paul and I'll make sure that's included. Let me make a quick note of that. Great. Okay. Okay, what text are we using? Some of you have asked this question before. What are we using? So when I quote a Mishnah, I use this is a translation that's on Sefaria, the translation of Rabbi Josh Kolp. I like his translation. I think it's pretty clear. This is what the Steinsaltz translation looks like on Sefaria, right? What's happening here, right? I explained this in class a few weeks ago. What's happening here, all of the bold letters, this is a screenshot from a piece of text that we saw in class last week. So I would say don't worry about the actual content for the moment, unless you were here last week, in which case it's a good opportunity for review. The bold words here in Steinsaltz's translation are the words that are actually in the original. All of the unbolded text are what Steinsaltz is putting in to help it be clearer, right? And you see there are quite a number of words that are not bolded, right? Which is to say that sometimes when you're learning the Talmud, there are a lot of words in your head that you need to fill in. What I do in my translation is I don't do bold and unbold. I use the Steinsaltz translation as a base. And then sometimes, in my opinion, Steinsaltz gives away too much too early and sort of steals some of the fun of doing the work. And so when that happens, I usually take those parts of the Steinsaltz out. I also make some translations. There are times where I, think a certain word is translated better, different way, things like that. But I use Steinsaltz as a base, and then go from there. Okay. All right. How are we doing on time? Okay. So what I want to do is look a little bit at the Mishnah that we've been studying together. Only part of it, right? Just to give you a sense of what the topic is that we're learning. Okay. So generally speaking, our topic is lost objects and what you have to do with them. All right. Generally speaking, there are three options, according to the rabbis. There are three options if you find a lost object. Number one, keep it. Number two, announce that you have it and try and find its rightful owner. Or number three, depending on the situation, let's say someone's name is on an object, just return it directly. Those are your three options. Okay, so this is the opening of our Mishnah. Okay, which found objects belong to the finder and which ones must be proclaimed? These found objects belong to the finder. If someone found scattered fruit, scattered money, small sheaves in the public domain, cakes of figs, baker's loaves, strings of fish, pieces of meat, wool shearings as they come from the country of origin, stalks of flax, and strips of purple wool, according to Rabbi Meir. Okay. According to Rabbi Meir, these are the objects that if you find, they're yours. Okay. Rabbi Judah adds, anything which has in it something unusual must be proclaimed. How is this so? If one found a fig cake with a potsherd in it, or a loaf with coins in it, the person must proclaim it. Right? The idea there being, if there's something unusual, either, let's say, something unusual, could come to include someone's name. Could just be, you usually when you find a cake, right? Fig cake was very popular in the rabbinic period. If you find a cake and it has a potsherd in it, you can go proclaim them and say, hi, did anyone in this area lose a fig cake with a potsherd in it? Right? Whereas if you just find a fig cake, right, it may not be so easy to, there's nothing distinguishing about it. That's gonna make it easy to proclaim and have someone come in and play. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar says new merchandise need not be proclaimed. Right, so if there's just merchandise that's on the shelves and there's it's sort of mass produced, right? That sort of gets to the fig cake from before, right? You don't have to proclaim those. You can keep those because there's no actual way of determining who the original owner is. Okay, I'm gonna pause for a second and see if there are questions. Okay, Jennifer. So I see you posted the Koren edition. That's great, right? That's what the right. So Steinsaltz has actual published books. Originally, his translation was in Hebrew, and then it was translated into English by several different people. Right. So that's just what Jennifer posted there. That's the Steinsaltz translation, as it is in book form. Great, thank you. Yeah, thank you for posting that. Okay. Next, right, this is not actually the next Mishnah. This is a later Mishnah. Okay. If someone, right, we spent a lot of time with this a couple weeks ago for those of you who are in the class. if someone found something in a shop, it belongs to them, right? What we talked about in class was like a bodega, right? Or I don't know, I live in New York City, but a supermarket, right? If you find an object in a supermarket, there's so many people walking through a supermarket, it's going to be very hard to find the original owner. You can go ahead and keep that, right? But if you found something between, let's say, the cash register and the shopkeeper, it belongs to the shopkeeper, right? If you find something in that area, you can reasonably assume that it belongs to the shopkeeper. If you found it in front of the money changer, right? So here, money changer has a table right in front of them. So in front of me, there'd be a table with coins. If in front of that table on the ground, you found something, right, then it belongs to the finder. But if you found it between the counter and the money changer, it belongs to the money changer, right? Same principle as the shopkeeper, just, two different types of store owners, right? If someone bought fruit from their fellow, or if the fellow sent fruit and one found coins therein, we talked about this too, this is probably in the bag with the fruit, not actually in the pear, let's say, right? It belongs to the finder, right? But if they were tied up, you've got to proclaim them, right? So if you get a bag of fruit and there are loose coins, then they're yours. But if it's tied up in a wallet, let's say, then you have to go and proclaim those because someone can actually come and claim them. Okay. This is our final, good, we got to the end. This is our final slide. Two key concepts in our chapter that for the people who've been around, you're familiar with these. For the people who are new, two things to think about. We're going to talk a lot about these concepts as we move forward. Number one is despair. If you can determine that the original owner would have despaired of recovering their item, then the finder can keep it. Right, so back to our bodega or grocery store example, right? If someone drops, let's say, $1 bill on the floor in a grocery store, right? You can, because there are so many people going in and out, walking in that space, you could reasonably assume that the person would, or you might be able to reasonably assume that the person would have despaired of the object, and that's why the finder can keep it. Okay, because of this despair factor, right? Despair is very important in this world. The other one is distinguishing marks, right? We talked about that a little bit a few slides ago with something unusual, right? If there are distinguishing marks on an item, someone wrote their name on a t-shirt, or there's something strange with the cake, right? Then you have to go proclaim the item, right? These two concepts, despair on the part of the original owner and distinguishing marks on an item that would allow you to, or that would allow the item to potentially be reclaimed, two very key pieces of what we're doing here. Okay, I'm gonna pause there. It's 8:59. Great. Great. So I'm just gonna check the chat. If you have in this final moment a question, you can go ahead and put it on the put it in the chat. Again, we are going to share the recording of at least my frontal presentation of this so that you have it. We're going to share, I know the slides had a lot of information. We're going to share the slides so that you can look at it on your own time. If you have any sorts of clarifying questions or anything like that, you can email me. You can just respond to the email that I sent you either last night or this morning and ask any follow-up questions, or you can respond to the email in which we send out the materials. I'd be happy to follow up. I know this was a lot. I know that some of it was material that might be totally new to you, totally challenging to you. Hopefully you come along in this journey, and there's a lot. I mean, I think the people who've been in the class can say we have a lot of fun, and the rabbis are a fascinating group of people. Hopefully we'll better understand them in their world over the course of the next few weeks and months. So thank you to Paul. Thank you to everyone who makes this happen. And Susie, I know you asked a question, and Liv, I think you've said it right. Come to class, and hopefully you'll get the answer. All right, have a good night, everyone. Take care.